On the morning of May 4th, 1903, at approximately 8:30, a prominent attorney climbed the steps of the BREATHITT County Courthouse in Jackson, Kentucky. His name was James Buchanan Markham, 45 years old, United States Commissioner, trustee of what would become the University of Kentucky, representing railroad corporations and defending clients across eastern Kentucky's coal country. Behind him, Curtis Jett emerged from the courthouse hallway, carrying a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson raised. 2 shots echoed through the valley. Markham fell forward down the limestone steps, his briefcase tumbling beside him, legal papers scattering across stone worn smooth by decades of boots. He died within seconds. For 15 minutes, his body lay where it fell. Hundreds of witnesses watched from storefronts and windows. No one dared approach. The shooter, standing in plain sight, 30 feet away. The county judge who'd ordered the killing watching from his store window across Main Street. The sheriff who'd co-conspired present at the scene. This wasn't backwoods lawlessness. This was systematic political assassination executed by elected officials in broad daylight. Between November 1902 and June 1903, just 7 months at least, 30 people died in BREATHITT County. Attorneys murdered on courthouse steps. Physicians riddled with bullets while making house calls. Town marshals shot from courthouse windows. All to answer one question: who controls a Kentucky county where coal money flows like water, and the men sworn to enforce law are the ones ordering murder? The answer: whoever is willing to kill for it. This wasn't about moonshine stills or family honor or centuries-old grudges. This was about a contested election, a brother shot in an illegal saloon, and the terrible mathematics of power. How many people you're willing to eliminate to keep it. If you have the courage to hear this story, where educated men become assassins, where witnesses testify knowing their houses will burn, where a nephew confesses his uncle ordered murders and walks free anyway, subscribe and leave your like. But I warn you, this contains extreme political violence based on verified court records, trial transcripts, and witness testimony, and it will force you to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and how thin the line is between defending what's yours and destroying everyone who opposes you. BREATHITT County sprawls across 495 square miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain in eastern Kentucky. The Cumberland Plateau rises in ridges over 2,000 feet. Their valleys so narrow that sunlight touches the bottom only a few hours each day. Sound travels strange in these mountains. Sometimes you hear a gunshot 5 miles away, echoing off limestone cliffs. Other times you don't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you until his hand touches your shoulder. The North Fork of the Kentucky River cuts through the county like an artery, bringing commerce, flooding, and the constant white noise of water over stone that becomes the soundtrack to every conversation, every transaction, every murder. In spring, when mountain snow melts, the river runs high and muddy, isolating hollows for days. In summer, it drops to expose sandbars where children play and men hide bodies. In 1888, everything changed. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad reached Jackson, punching through mountains that had kept BREATHITT County isolated since its founding in 1839. With the railroad came outside capital, timber companies wanting the ancient forests, coal speculators wanting the seams buried in the ridges. Money poured into Jackson like floodwater. The population exploded during the first decade of the 20th century. Men arrived looking for work. Families followed. Businesses opened. The general store that had served a few hundred farmers suddenly served thousands. And local entrepreneurs, men who understood mountain politics better than any outsider, could position themselves as gatekeepers between Appalachian resources and industrial America's insatiable appetite. Men like James Henderson Hargis. James Henderson Hargis was born into poverty in the 1860s. The kind of poverty that meant going hungry, meant no education beyond what his mother could teach, meant watching wealthier families pass by without acknowledgement. His father left no fortune, no land, no connections, just a name, and the understanding that in BREATHITT County, You made your own way, or you starved. By 1901, at approximately 40 years old, Hargis had transformed himself into the most powerful man in BREATHITT County. He co-owned the Hargis Brothers General Store with his brother Alexander, the commercial center of Jackson, where people bought tools, food, ammunition, fabric, medicine, everything necessary for mountain life, and where they accumulated debt. Debt meant leverage. Leverage meant control. If you owed the Hargis brothers money, you voted the way they suggested. You testified the way they needed. You looked away when they needed silence. Hargis had made another strategic move. He'd married Nancy South, daughter of Jeremiah Weldon South. The South family had been in Jackson since before it had a name, since before BREATHITT County existed as a political entity. They were founding stock, respectable, connected. Nancy brought social legitimacy that Hargis's own family couldn't provide, the kind of respectability that transforms a poor merchant into a gentleman, that opens doors to political power. In the fall of 1901, James Hargis was elected county judge by a considerable majority. The position controlled county appointments, budgets, court proceedings, and most importantly, who got prosecuted for what crimes. In most counties, the judge is a judicial figure. In BREATHITT County, the county judge was the most powerful political position available. But Hargis understood something fundamental about power. It's not enough to win elections. You have to control the men who enforce them. And that meant putting the right man in the sheriff's office. Ed Callahan won the sheriff's race in the fall of 1901 by the narrowest of margins. So narrow that his opponents immediately contested the election, claiming fraud, intimidation, ballot manipulation. The legal challenge dragged through courts for months, creating a volatile situation. Callahan wore the badge, commanded deputies, controlled arrests, but his legitimacy remained under legal challenge. Every day he served as sheriff was a day the losing side believed was stolen. Every arrest he made was tainted by the question of whether he had legal authority to make it. And James Hargis stood beside him, using his political power and his money to defend Callahan's election through every legal maneuver available. Because sheriffs in BREATHITT County didn't just arrest criminals, they decided who was a criminal. Opposing this consolidation of power was the Cockrell family. They'd been in BREATHITT County as long as anyone could remember. Simon Cockrell Sr. had donated 10 acres for the county seat when Jackson was founded in 1839. They were landowners, founding family, the kind of people who expected their opinions to matter. Tom Cockrell wore the town marshal badge, a position that controlled law enforcement within Jackson city limits, separate from the county sheriff's jurisdiction. His cousin James, born June 1st, 1876, had just returned from the Spanish-American War with the 4th Kentucky Infantry. He was 25 years old in 1902, carrying military training and the confidence that comes from surviving combat. The Cockrells weren't political operatives scheming for power. They were law enforcement doing their jobs. But in BREATHITT County in 1902, there was no such thing as neutral law enforcement. Every badge represented a faction. Every arrest was a political act. Standing between these two power centers was James Buchanan Markham. Born in 1858, he was 44 years old in 1902, old enough to remember when BREATHITT County settled disputes through courts instead of bullets. He'd practiced law there for 17 years, representing railroad companies, serving as United States Commissioner, building a practice that gave him independence from local patronage. For years, Markham had represented the Hargis faction. James Hargis had been a client. They'd worked together on cases, shared professional courtesies. Then came the 1901 election contests. The Republican candidates who lost to Hargis and Callahan needed legal representation to challenge the results. They hired Markham, and Markham took the case. In that moment, he stopped being a lawyer and became an enemy. From Hargis's perspective, Markham had committed the ultimate betrayal, using legal knowledge gained while representing the Hargis faction to now attack them in court. It was personal. It was business. It was the kind of transgression that mountain honor culture couldn't forgive. Was Markham courageous for switching sides, standing up to corruption regardless of previous loyalties? Or was he an opportunistic attorney who saw a bigger payday representing challengers to power? Both things can be true simultaneously. That's what makes this story uncomfortable. There are no heroes here, just people making choices that seem justified until the bodies start piling up. The stage was set. Hargis and Callahan controlled county government. The Cockrells controlled town law enforcement. Markham was challenging the election results in court. 3 power centers, incompatible, in a county where political disputes were increasingly settled with bullets instead of ballots. All it needed was a spark. That spark came on a cold February night in an illegal saloon. February 19th, 1902, 7:45 in the evening. Bailey's Blind Tiger sat on Main Street in Jackson. Blind Tiger being the polite mountain term for an illegal saloon where whiskey flowed without federal tax stamps, where gambling happened openly, where law enforcement was expected to look the other way. The kind of establishment that existed in the grey space between legal commerce and criminal enterprise, tolerated because everyone who mattered drank there. The temperature outside hovered near freezing. Inside, coal stoves radiated heat that made men's faces flush, made tempers shorter, made small disagreements feel like mortal insults. Benjamin Hargis pushed open the door. He was Judge James Hargis's younger brother, less politically powerful, less wealthy, but carrying the family name like a weapon. When Benjamin walked into a room, people understood he represented not just himself, but the entire Hargis political machine. Tom Cockrell sat at a card table near the back. He was town marshal, wearing the badge even off duty, because in BREATHITT County, you wore your badge everywhere, or someone might forget who you were. But in Bailey's Blind Tiger, nobody was really on duty. You left official business at the door and settled things the old way. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask. Some witnesses claimed Benjamin started it loud, drunk, aggressive, looking to provoke the marshal who'd arrested several Hargis associates over the previous months. They said he made threats, used language no man could ignore, forced Tom Cockrell into a position where backing down meant surrendering his authority forever. Other witnesses swore Tom Cockrell was the aggressor flexing his martial authority in a place where it didn't apply, harassing Benjamin Hargis because he couldn't touch the county judge directly. They said Tom had been drinking too, had been waiting for an opportunity to strike at the Hargis family. What everyone agrees on, voices rose, chairs scraped back against wooden floor. Other patrons moved toward the walls, creating space, and hands moved toward pistols. Tom Cockrell drew first, 2 shots. Close range, close enough to see the other man's eyes widen, close enough to smell gunpowder mixing with whiskey and sweat. Benjamin Hargis clutched his stomach, blood spreading dark across his shirt, and fell backward against the bar before collapsing to the floor. Men ran for doctors. Others ran to tell the sheriff. Some ran to the Hargis brothers' store to tell the county judge that his brother was dying. By dawn on February 20th, Benjamin Hargis was dead. 2 bullets had caused massive internal injuries that no physician in Jackson could stop. He left a wife and children whose names the historical record doesn't preserve because in BREATHITT County, the dead are remembered but their families are forgotten. Judge James Hargis stood over his brother's body and swore revenge, not privately, not whispered to confidants, publicly, in front of witnesses. He named Tom Cockrell. He named James Cockrell. He made it clear that the Cockrell family would pay for what happened in Bailey's Blind Tiger. The legal system moved into action with the illusion of legitimacy. The grand jury returned an indictment against Tom Cockrell for murder. Governor J.C. Beckham appointed Ali W. Young as special judge to handle the case, recognizing that local judges might be compromised. Tom Cockrell was stripped of his town marshal badge and arrested. The system appeared to be working, but everyone in BREATHITT County understood the real question wasn't whether Tom Cockrell would face trial. The question was whether James Hargis would wait for one. James Cockrell, Tom's cousin, age 25, recently returned from the Spanish-American War, was promoted to fill the vacant marshal position. The message was clear. Removing one cockerel from power just meant another cockerel would take his place. The family wouldn't surrender their authority over town law enforcement just because one of them had killed a haggis. Tom Cockrell needed a lawyer. He asked James Buchanan Markham. This was the moment that sealed Markham's fate. He was already representing the Republican candidates challenging the Hargis-Callahan election victories. Now he would defend the man who'd killed the county judge's brother. From Hargis's perspective, this wasn't just legal representation. This was Markham openly aligning himself with the Cockrell faction, using his legal expertise to protect the people trying to dismantle Hargis's political power. Dr. B. D. Cox encouraged Markham to take the case. Cox was a respected physician in Jackson, serving as Tom Cockrell's legal guardian, an older family member responsible for the younger man's welfare. But Cox had his own reasons for opposing Hargis. He was married to a Cardwell. The Cardwell family had been feuding with the Hargises for years over land, politics, business disputes that had roots going back decades. This wasn't just about Benjamin's death. This was about choosing sides in a war that predated the shooting. Markham took the case. By doing so, he placed himself on a list. Not a written list, nothing that could be subpoenaed or used as evidence. But everyone understood Markham was now an enemy. He would need to be dealt with. The only question was when. Spring arrived. The mountains turned green. The North Fork ran high with snowmelt, and tensions escalated into open confrontation. Main Street, Jackson, mid-morning, warm enough that men stood in shirt sleeves. James Cockrell, now wearing the town marshal badge, stood outside the Hargis brothers' store with his brother Tom. Despite Tom being under indictment for murder, they had a warrant for Judge Hargis's arrest. Some minor charge, the kind of legal harassment that defined politics in BREATHITT County, disturbing the peace, disorderly conduct, something designed to humiliate rather than genuinely prosecute. James Cockrell's hand rested on his pistol. Tom stood beside him, making it clear that an indictment for killing Benjamin Hargis hadn't made him disappear. They weren't hiding. This was theatre. We're still here. We still control town law enforcement. Judge Hargis emerged from his store, saw the Cockrells, saw their hands near their weapons, and ran back inside. Sheriff Ed Callahan appeared from across the street, hand on his own weapon. Now it became a jurisdictional nightmare. The town marshal had power to arrest within Jackson city limits. So did the county sheriff. If both were present with conflicting intentions, who had legal authority, Kentucky law provided no clear answer, deliberately leaving grey areas that allowed for exactly this kind of confrontation. Hargis claimed he'd surrendered to Sheriff Callahan before the Cockrells could serve their warrant, meaning Callahan had legal custody, making the Cockrells' warrant void and their continued presence interference with a lawful arrest. The Cockrells claimed Hargis surrendered to Callahan only after they'd attempted to serve their warrant, meaning Callahan had drawn his weapon to protect Hargis from legitimate law enforcement, making Callahan guilty of obstruction. Both versions can't be true. Both sides filed formal complaints. Nothing was resolved. The courts couldn't adjudicate because both badges had legitimate legal standing. But the real message had nothing to do with law. The message was, the rule of law in BREATHITT County depends entirely on which badge you recognize as legitimate, and if you recognize the wrong one, you die. For months, an uneasy standoff held. Tom Cockrell's trial was repeatedly delayed. Judge Hargis made no public move for revenge. Sheriff Callahan continued making arrests almost exclusively of people who'd opposed his election or supported the Cockrell faction. But privately, the list was being compiled. Names of people who'd crossed the Hargis-Callahan machine. People who would need to be eliminated before they could testify, before they could organize opposition, before they could become threats to the consolidation of power. The assassinations began in summer 1902, and they followed a pattern methodical, public, executed with no fear of arrest, because the people ordering them controlled who got arrested. Summer 1902. Evening, approximately 8 o'clock. Dr. B.D. Cox walked through Jackson's darkened streets carrying his physician's bag. Someone was sick. Someone needed a doctor. He'd made this walk hundreds of times up mud-slick alleys, into hollows where families couldn't afford to bring their children to town, places where medical care meant a doctor willing to come to you. Doctors had immunity. That was the unwritten rule, even in bloody BREATHITT. You didn't shoot the man who might save your child's life next week. You didn't kill the physician who delivered half the babies in the county. Professional neutrality was supposed to be sacred. The ambush came from darkness. Multiple shooters, positioned to create crossfire with no escape. Dr. Cox fell before he could understand what was happening, before he could drop his medical bag, before he could even process the sound of gunfire. By the time anyone found him, he was dead. The newspaper described the scene in stark terms. He'd been shot repeatedly, the kind of deliberate excess that sent a message beyond mere killing that nobody was protected anymore. Dr. Cox was Tom Cockrell's guardian. He'd encouraged Markham to take Tom's case after Benjamin Hargis's death. He was married to a Cardwell, a family that had opposed the Hargises for decades. His assassination wasn't random violence. It was eliminating a specific name from a specific list. Jackson changed overnight. Stores that usually stayed open until 9 or 10 in the evening now locked their doors at dusk. Families drew their blinds tight, not opening them even during daylight hours. The streets usually filled with people visiting neighbors, conducting business, children playing emptied as soon as the sun touched the western ridges. Armed men began patrolling Main Street, stopping anyone they didn't recognize, demanding to know their business. No badges, no legal authority, just rifles and revolvers, and the understanding that Sheriff Callahan wouldn't stop them. That law enforcement had become indistinguishable from private militia. The Hargis brothers moved through town with bodyguards, now 3 or 4 armed men forming a protective cordon, making it clear that anyone approaching Judge Hargis or his brother Alexander did so at mortal risk. Their store was guarded day and night. Men with shotguns sat in chairs on the porch, watching Main Street, tracking who came and went. Fear had replaced law as the governing principle of BREATHITT County, and everyone understood the killing had just started. Here's the uncomfortable part that makes this story more than just a recitation of violence. The Hargis faction genuinely believed they were protecting themselves. From their perspective, they were under siege. Benjamin had been killed by the town marshal. The Cockrells had attempted to arrest Judge Hargis with drawn revolvers. Political enemies were using courts and warrants as weapons, trying to dismantle through legal harassment what couldn't be defeated at the ballot box. The bodyguards, the armed patrols, the fortified store was that paranoia or reasonable precaution. Both things can be true simultaneously. And that's what made BREATHITT County so lethally dangerous. Everyone believed they were defending themselves. Everyone had justification. Everyone was convinced the other side started it. July 20th, 1902, approximately noon. The summer sky was cloudless, temperature climbing toward 90 degrees. Main Street was busy with normal Monday activity, merchants arranging displays, farmers bringing produce to sell, women shopping with children, men conducting business outside the courthouse. Life continuing despite Dr. Cox's murder, because life had to continue. James Cockrell walked his rounds as town marshal, 26 years old. He'd worn the badge for only 5 months, inheriting it after his cousin Tom killed Benjamin Hargis, which meant everyone in Jackson knew James Cockrell was a marked man. Wearing that badge meant wearing a target. He stood in front of a store on Main Street, talking with companions, normal conversation, discussing nothing important, weather, crops, local gossip, his back to the courthouse. The shot came from a courthouse window. James Cockrell fell forward, blood spreading across his shirt before he hit the ground. His companions scattered, running for cover, leaving him dying in the street. And for the second time in less than 2 months, a body lay on Main Street in broad daylight, while hundreds of people watched from windows and doorways, too terrified to approach, too afraid that moving toward the body meant becoming the next target. Curtis Jett was arrested for the murder. He was Judge Hargis's nephew, son of the judge's sister, raised in the Hargis extended family network, loyal to the family above everything else. His alibi was that he'd been in his uncle's store at the time of the shooting. The courthouse window was approximately 100 yards from the Hargis brothers' store, an impossible alibi to verify dozens of people were in the store. Any of them could claim to have seen Jett there. An impossible alibi to disprove dozens of people were on Main Street, none of them willing to testify they saw Jett elsewhere. Jett was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The Kentucky Court of Appeals reversed the conviction on technical grounds, rather than face a second trial with the same uncertain outcome. Jett accepted a life sentence. He served less than a year before being quietly released. He would remain free to commit the murder everyone knew was coming, the one he would eventually confess to. After James Cockrell's murder, Judge Hargis made a gesture that was either magnanimous or mocking, depending on your interpretation. He sent a message to James Markham offering to have warrants served on anyone Markham suspected of the killing. Think about the audacity of that offer. The county judge whose nephew had just been convicted of murder offering to use his political authority to investigate his own family. It was theatre, a public display that said, "I control law enforcement so completely that I can offer to investigate myself." Markham didn't respond. He was already making a different calculation. How long until I'm next November, 1902? Moses Feltner came to Markham's house after dark. Feltner was connected to the Hargis faction not in a circle, but close enough to hear things, close enough to be asked to do things. He told Markham about the assassination plot. He'd been approached, asked to kill Markham, and he'd said yes because refusing meant his own death. Then Feltner did something extraordinary. He showed Markham the infrastructure of assassination guns hidden around Jackson, behind barrels and under steps and in courthouse alcoves, ready for any Hargis operative to grab if they got a clear shot. The courthouse itself had been weaponized. The streets were ambush points. Jackson had become a kill box with Markham as the designated target. Markham made a desperate and morally troubling decision that reveals how completely law enforcement had failed. Understanding this choice requires recognizing the impossible situation he faced. He began using his own children as human shields. For weeks, everywhere he went, a child walked beside him, not from fatherly affection, but from survival strategy. He believed, correctly, that assassins wouldn't risk killing a child to reach him. This calculated use of his own children demonstrates how political violence corrupts even parental instincts, forcing a father to choose between protecting his children from poverty and orphanhood versus placing them in potential crossfire. There were no good choices left. For 3 months after James Cockrell's murder, Markham didn't leave his house at all. He conducted his legal practice from his kitchen table, met clients in his front room, lived like a prisoner. When he finally emerged, his wife or women friends always accompanied him. The children remained his constant protection. Then he wrote a letter to the Lexington Herald detailing everything: the plots, the hidden weapons, the conspiracy between Judge Hargis and Sheriff Callahan, the complete collapse of law enforcement. The letter was published November 11th, 1902, with Moses Feltner's sworn affidavit as supporting evidence. Judge Hargis read that letter, saw his name, saw the accusations going to national newspapers, and understood that Markham had moved from legal opponent to existential threat. A man filing lawsuits could be beaten in court. A man hiding in his house could be waited out. But a man telling the national press about systematic political assassination had to die. For 6 months, James Markham calculated every morning whether today would be his last. May 4th, 1903, he made the decision that killed him. He went to the courthouse alone. May 4th, 1903. Morning. For reasons lost to history. James Buchanan. Markham decided to walk to the BREATHITT County Courthouse alone. For the first time in months, perhaps the first time since Moses Feltner had shown him the hidden weapons stashed around Jackson, No wife walked beside him. No child held his hand. No women friends provided cover through their presence. Just Markham, age 44, carrying a briefcase full of legal papers. Walking toward courthouse steps he'd climbed 1,000 times in 17 years of legal practice. Maybe he thought the danger had passed. 6 months since Feltner's warning. And he was still alive. The terror of autumn 1902, when he'd used his children as shields, when he'd refused to leave his house for 3 months, had faded into routine precaution. Maybe he calculated that Monday morning at 8:30 was too public for ambush. Too many witnesses. Too much traffic. Surely no one would execute a murder on courthouse steps on a Monday morning when lawyers and clerks and ordinary citizens were arriving for the week's business. Or maybe he was simply exhausted from living in constant fear. Maybe he'd decided that if they were going to kill him, let them do it, because hiding forever wasn't living. We'll never know why James Markham walked alone that morning. We only know it was the last mistake he ever made. The temperature hovered in the low 60s, climbing toward what would be a pleasant 70 degrees by afternoon. Early May in the Cumberland Plateau means dogwood blooming white across the ridges, redbud flowers painting the hillsides purple, the North Fork running clear and low after winter floods have subsided. The river's constant murmur provides soundtrack to everything that happens in Jackson, a white noise so persistent that people stop hearing it until it suddenly stops. Main Street was busy with Monday morning activity, horses tied at hitching posts, shifting their weight, tails swishing at early season flies, store owners sweeping their porches, arranging displays, preparing for the week, farmers bringing produce, women shopping with children, men gathering outside the courthouse, discussing cases, politics, the weather, anything except the fear that had governed Jackson for nearly a year. Markham climbed the courthouse steps, limestone worn smooth and slightly concave by decades of boots. He encountered Belvin James Ewan on the steps. Ewan was a deputy sheriff, employed by Ed Callahan, but more complicated than simple faction loyalty. He had family in Jackson going back generations, and occupied that dangerous middle ground where professional obligation conflicted with personal survival. They stopped to talk. Two men who'd known each other for years, engaging in the kind of casual conversation that happens on courthouse steps every Monday morning in every county seat in America. What did they discuss? The weather turning warm. The Tom Cockrell case that was still pending trial. Local gossip. The historical record preserves none of this, only that they talked. That Markham was relaxed enough to stop and engage in normal human interaction. Markham stood facing Main Street, his back to the courthouse door. Behind him, inside the hallway where limestone walls created acoustic dead zones that swallowed footsteps, Curtis Jett and Tom White positioned themselves. 8:29 in the morning. Tom White emerged from the courthouse hallway. He walked past Markham, close enough to touch. Close enough that Markham would have smelled tobacco smoke on his clothes, would have heard his boots on stone. White muttered something as he passed. Multiple witnesses heard it, but couldn't make out the words. Could have been greeting, could have been warning, could have been nothing at all, except nervous sound from a man about to witness murder. White kept walking into the street, drawing Markham's attention, causing him to turn slightly to watch this oddly behaving man. Markham's back now fully exposed to the courthouse door. 8:30 exactly. Curtis Jett stepped from the courthouse hallway into morning sunlight. He was Judge Hargis's nephew, recently released from prison after serving less than a year. Recently released from prison after serving less than a year of a life sentence for killing James Cockrell. He held a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, a weapon commonly carried in Appalachian law enforcement of the era. He raised the weapon, aimed at James Markham's back from 15 feet away, close enough that missing was impossible, far enough to claim he'd felt threatened if anyone questioned the distance. Two shots echoed across Jackson. In mountain terrain, sound behaves unpredictably. Witnesses later disagreed on exactly what they'd heard. Sound behaves strangely in mountains. Sometimes you hear gunfire 5 miles away. Other times you don't hear a man shooting someone standing next to you until your ears stop ringing. James Buchanan. Markham's hat flew off, tumbling down the steps. He started to turn, his lawyer's briefcase falling from his hand, one arm reaching toward nothing, toward empty air, toward help that wouldn't come. His lips moved. Witnesses standing close enough swore they heard him gasp, "Oh, Lordy!" Not a scream, not a plea, just an involuntary acknowledgement that this was finally happening, that the fear he'd lived with for 8 months had materialized into bullets in his back. Then he fell forward down the courthouse steps, his body striking limestone with sounds that would haunt Belvin Ewan for the rest of his life. The briefcase tumbled beside him, legal papers scattering across stone now slick with blood spreading from entry wounds no physician in Jackson could have treated, even if they'd been standing there. He died within seconds. The bullets had struck vital areas. Death came within seconds, faster than his brain could process what was happening. But his death didn't matter to what happened next. For 15 minutes, James Buchanan Markham's body lay on the courthouse steps. Blood spread across grey limestone, pooling in the worn depressions of the courthouse steps. His briefcase lay open 3 steps above his body. Papers, legal motions, affidavits, correspondence fluttered in the morning breeze that always rises in mountain valleys as the sun climbs. His hat rested 5 steps down, crown crushed where it had struck stone. Hundreds of people watched from storefronts and windows and the street itself. Belvin Ewan stood frozen where he'd been talking to Markham moments before, close enough to see the entry wounds in Markham's back, close enough to identify Curtis Jett beyond any possibility of doubt. Deputies employed by Sheriff Callahan stood on Main Street, clearly visible, making no move toward the courthouse. The town marshal's office sat 50 yards away. Its door remained closed. No one moved toward the body. Not to check for pulse, though everyone could see he was dead. Not to cover him with a coat, though that was mountain custom. Not even to collect the scattered papers now blowing across Main Street. Because everyone understood the same calculations simultaneously approaching that body meant choosing a side. Helping Markham's corpse meant opposing the Hargis-Callahan machine, and opposing them meant you were next, across Main Street, in the second-floor window of the Hargis brothers' store. Judge James Hargis watched. Whether he felt satisfaction or horror or relief, only he knew. But he didn't order his bodyguards to approach. He didn't send anyone to collect the body or restore order or maintain even the fiction of law. He let the body lie there, a message written in blood on courthouse steps that everyone in BREATHITT County would understand. This is what happens when you challenge us. Curtis Jett pulled the trigger. But who was responsible? Jett. For the physical act, Judge Hargis, who Jett would later confess had ordered the killing Sheriff Callahan, who according to that confession was co-conspirator. The hundreds of witnesses who watched and did nothing. The federal authorities who'd ignored Markham's published warnings. The Kentucky courts that had released Jett to commit this murder. Everyone shares responsibility. No one accepts it. That's how systematic political violence works. It diffuses guilt until no individual feels accountable. The day after James Buchanan Markham's assassination, schools in Jackson closed. Churches announced they would not hold services until further notice. Not because of official decree, because parents refused to send their children into streets where attorneys died on courthouse steps. Because ministers understood that gathering congregations created target-rich environments for anyone wanting to eliminate multiple witnesses simultaneously. Curtis Jett walked freely through Jackson for days after the murder. No arrest, no charges. He visited his mother, shopped at the Hargis brothers' store, ate meals in public restaurants. Sheriff Callahan's deputies passed him on the street and nodded greeting. The message was clear: law enforcement would not act against him, because law enforcement had ordered the killing. Judge James Hargis made a public statement offering to assist in investigating Markham's murder. The audacity was breathtaking, the man who would later be named as ordering the assassination publicly volunteering to investigate himself. But it played well in local newspapers. created the appearance of cooperation, allowed Hargis to claim he wanted justice while ensuring justice would never arrive. National media descended on Jackson. Reporters from New York, Chicago, Philadelphia arrived by train, sending dispatches describing BREATHITT County as a place where elected officials ordered murders in broad daylight, where hundreds of witnesses watched attorneys die and no one dared testify, where the boundary between government and organized crime had ceased to exist. The stories reached Frankfort. Kentucky's Governor J.C. Beckham faced a choice: allow BREATHITT County to remain an autonomous zone where state law didn't apply, or intervene with force. He chose intervention. Belvin James Ewan had been standing beside Markham when the shots were fired. Blood had spattered his boots. He'd seen Curtis Jett emerge from the courthouse hallway, seen the revolver raised, seen everything, which made him the most valuable witness in BREATHITT County and the most endangered. Within hours of the assassination, Ewan was taken to the second floor of the Hargis brothers' store. Not arrested, invited. Judge Hargis, Sheriff Callahan, and several armed adherents were waiting. They asked Ewan what he'd seen, who had shot Markham, whether he could identify the killer. Ewan understood the calculation immediately. Tell the truth and die. Lie and maybe survive. He lied. He claimed he hadn't seen the shooter's face clearly, that everything had happened too fast, that he couldn't identify anyone with certainty, because he was sure, absolutely certain, that telling the truth in that room meant he wouldn't leave the building alive. The next day, Ewan told friends the truth. He named Curtis Jett. He described exactly what he'd witnessed. And those friends understood Belvin Ewan had just signed his own death warrant. 200 Kentucky state troops arrived in Jackson in late May 1903, equipped with rifles, artillery, and orders to restore state authority by any means necessary. They established martial law, occupied the courthouse, patrolled Main Street in formations that made clear this wasn't polite assistance. This was military occupation. Curtis Jett was visiting his mother when soldiers surrounded the house. He surrendered without resistance, reportedly telling the arresting officer he was anxious to be taken to Jackson for trial. The statement sounds like cooperation until you realize what it actually meant. Jett understood that in military custody, he was safer than anywhere else in BREATHITT County. The Hargis-Callahan machine couldn't reach him while soldiers guarded him. Neither could the Cockrell faction seeking revenge. Tom White was captured separately, arrested by troops who'd been searching for him since the assassination. Both men were held under heavy guard while prosecutors built cases. Belvin Ewan's house burned during the troop occupation. No investigation. No arrests. The fire was ruled accidental, despite occurring during a military occupation, specifically designed to prevent retaliation against witnesses. The message was clear: even through the presence of 200 armed soldiers, testify and lose everything. But Ewan testified anyway. Curtis Jett, facing execution, made a decision that shattered the entire conspiracy. He confessed. Not a vague admission, a detailed, specific confession that named names and described the organizational structure of political assassination in BREATHITT County. I killed James Buchanan Markham, Jett told prosecutors. Judge Hargis ordered me to do it. Sheriff Callahan was part of the conspiracy. They told me Markham had to die because he was threatening their political control. Then Jett added something that revealed how the machine actually functioned. Alexander Hargis had nothing to do with it. Alexander was Judge Hargis's brother, co-owner of the Hargis brothers' store. By explicitly exonerating Alexander, Jett was demonstrating that he knew the internal dynamics of the conspiracy intimately enough to distinguish between who gave orders and who merely benefited from them. It gave his confession credibility. He wasn't just claiming everyone was guilty, he was providing nuanced detail about organizational structure. Jett also confessed to killing Dr. B. D. Cox, the physician riddled with bullets while making a house call. He confirmed what Moses Feltner had told Markham: there was a list of people to be eliminated, and Hargis and Callahan had ordered their execution. The confession created a legal earthquake. Kentucky's entire political establishment faced the reality that a sitting county judge and sheriff had ordered systematic political assassinations. If Jett's testimony held up in court, it meant elected officials had weaponized their authority to eliminate opposition through murder. But conviction required more than confession. It required witnesses willing to testify despite knowing their houses would burn, their families threatened, their lives destroyed. It required men like Belvin Ewan choosing truth over survival. And in BREATHITT County in 1903, that was the rarest commodity of all. The first trial took place in Morgan County, far enough from BREATHITT that jurors wouldn't fear walking to their homes after delivering a verdict, close enough that they understood mountain politics, understood that convicting Curtis Jett meant implicating Judge James Hargis, understood that acquitting him meant endorsing political assassination. Belvin James Ewan took the witness stand. The man whose house had burned during military occupation, who'd been interrogated by the men who ordered the murder, who'd lied initially because he was certain, absolutely certain, that telling truth meant death, who had every rational reason to stay silent, to claim memory loss, to protect himself by destroying evidence. He testified anyway. He identified Curtis Jett as the shooter without hesitation, without qualification, without the careful hedging that witnesses use when they're uncertain. He described standing beside James Markham, described the conversation they'd been having, described Tom White walking past muttering, described Jett emerging from the courthouse hallway with the .45 caliber Smith & Wesson raised. He described the sound of the shots, the way Markham gasped, "Oh Lordy," the 15 minutes the body lay on the courthouse steps while hundreds watched. The defense attacked his credibility. Why had he lied initially? How could he be certain of identification when everything happened so quickly? Wasn't he biased against the Hargis faction because his house had burned? Ewan held firm. He'd lied initially because he feared for his life. He was certain of identification because Jett had been 15 feet away in morning sunlight. His house had burned because he'd told friends the truth. The jury deliberated. 11 jurors voted to convict. 1 voted to acquit. That single holdout whose name the historical record didn't preserve, whose reasoning was never made public, created a hung jury. Either he had genuine reasonable doubt that 11 other jurors didn't share, or he'd been bought, intimidated, or planted on the jury specifically to prevent conviction. In BREATHITT County politics, all 3 explanations were equally plausible. All 3 had precedent. Hung jury meant mistrial. Curtis Jett remained in military custody, but Judge Hargis and Sheriff Callahan remained free, conducting county business, attending court, living as if nothing had changed. The Commonwealth of Kentucky moved for a second trial in Harrison County. The motion argued that fair trial in or near BREATHITT County was impossible, that witness intimidation, threat of violence, political control of the Hargis-Callahan machine, and the risk of bloodshed made justice unattainable in any adjacent jurisdiction. The court agreed. Belvin Ewan testified again. Standing in a courtroom farther from home, knowing his house was already destroyed, knowing the Hargis faction had demonstrated their reach extended beyond BREATHITT County, he identified Curtis Jett as James Markham's assassin, again without hesitation, again with precise detail, again risking everything for a legal system that had already failed once to convict. This time, the jury convicted. Curtis Jett life in prison for murdering James Buchanan Markham. Tom White life in prison as co-conspirator. Both men would serve their sentences in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, removed from BREATHITT County politics, unable to commit further assassinations on behalf of their political patrons. But Judge James Hargis and Sheriff Ed Callahan, the men Curtis Jett had named in his confession as ordering the murders, stood trial multiple times in multiple venues. And every time, juries deadlocked or acquitted. The triggerman went to prison. The masterminds walked free. December 1905. A civil jury in Clark County assessed $8,000 in damages plus approximately $3,000 in costs against Hargis and Callahan for James Cockrell's murder. The jury believed, by preponderance of evidence, that they were responsible for the town marshal's assassination. $8,000 in 1905 equals roughly $270,000 today. Significant money. Public acknowledgement of guilt, but not criminal conviction, not prison, not consequences that would prevent them from continuing to order assassinations. Summer 1906. Judge Hargis was formally acquitted of James Markham's murder by a jury in Lee County, then acquitted of Dr. B. D. Cox's murder by a jury in BREATHITT County, tried in the very county where he'd served as county judge, where his political machine controlled juries, where witnesses understood that testifying against him meant retaliation. Then acquitted by a Scott County jury meeting in Fayette County for James Cockrell's murder. 3 assassinations, 3 trials, 3 acquittals. Sheriff Ed Callahan similarly beat every criminal charge. The man Curtis Jett had named as co-conspirator, who'd stood on Main Street while Markham's body lay bleeding on courthouse steps, who'd controlled law enforcement while systematic political murders were committed, walked free. This wasn't a failure of evidence. Curtis Jett had confessed in detail. Belvin Ewan had testified twice. Moses Feltner had provided sworn affidavit documenting the conspiracy. The infrastructure of assassination was documented, public, undeniable. This was a failure of the entire system. Criminal conviction requires unanimous jury verdict beyond reasonable doubt. Civil judgment requires preponderance of evidence with lower threshold. The same evidence that convinced civil juries to assess damages couldn't convince criminal juries to convict, because criminal conviction meant acknowledging that elected officials had weaponized their authority for murder. And mountain juries, even outside BREATHITT County, understood the implications convicting Hargis and Callahan meant admitting the entire political system was corrupted beyond redemption. Easier to blame the nephew who pulled the trigger. Easier to accept the comfortable lie that this was individual criminality rather than systematic state-sponsored assassination. During the trials, a defense witness was convicted of perjury caught lying under oath to create alibi for Curtis Jett. He confessed after conviction, explaining that BREATHITT County officials had intimidated him, threatened his family, told him exactly what testimony to provide. His confession detailed the infrastructure of witness tampering that made prosecuting the Hargis faction nearly impossible. How potential jurors were approached before trials. How witnesses were visited at night. How the mere fact of being subpoenaed to testify created immediate danger. The perjurer was released because his confession implicated higher officials. Those higher officials were never charged. The system that created him, the machinery of intimidation that forced false testimony, continued operating. Curtis Jett and Tom White served their sentences. Judge Hargis and Sheriff Callahan returned to their positions. And everyone in BREATHITT County understood justice without consequence isn't justice, it's theater. Curtis Jett entered the Kentucky State Penitentiary as a convicted double murderer assassin for the Hargis political machine, nephew who'd killed on command, triggerman responsible for at least 2 deaths and probably more that were never prosecuted. Something happened to him in prison. The transformation was documented by Rev. Joseph Severance, the prison chaplain who had no reason to lie about a convicted killer's spiritual state. Severance called Jett one of the best Bible scholars he ever saw, not just a man who'd found religion as performance for parole boards, but someone who genuinely engaged with Scripture, who could discuss theological complexity, who knew the text better than many ministers. Jett earned a certificate from the International Sunday School League, qualifying him to teach Sunday school. According to witnesses, he displayed that certificate with more pride than he'd ever shown for his marksmanship, more pride than he'd shown for successfully completing political assassinations. The best thing that ever happened to me, Jett told visitors, was when I was sent to the penitentiary. Ministers campaigned for his parole. Women's organizations from across Kentucky submitted petitions. Community leaders testified to his transformation. The State Board of Control chairman argued that Jett had been reared in the feud atmosphere of those days and knew nothing else, essentially claiming he was a product of his environment, shaped by violence before he could understand alternatives, capable of genuine redemption. Does Bible study atone for assassination? Can a man who murdered an attorney on courthouse steps genuinely change? Or was this elaborate performance designed to manipulate parole boards into early release? The historical evidence suggests Jett's conversion was sincere. Multiple witnesses over many years, consistent behavior, no evidence of deception. But sincerity doesn't resurrect the dead. James Markham's children grew up without their father, whether Curtis Jett memorized every verse in the Gospel of John or not. Dr. Cox's widow lived alone, whether Jett became the most devoted Bible scholar in Kentucky. Redemption is personal. Justice is communal. Jett may have saved his soul, but he never restored what he destroyed. Judge James Hargis beat every criminal charge. The Commonwealth of Kentucky tried him for 3 separate murders and failed to convict him once. He remained county judge. He remained powerful in Breathitt County politics for years after the trials. He continued operating the Hargis brothers' store, continued wielding influence over appointments and elections, continued living as if systematic political assassination was just unfortunate history. But power built on violence eventually consumes itself. For 6 months after the trials, Hargis became a virtual prisoner in his own store. He rarely left. Armed bodyguards accompanied him everywhere. He understood that families of his victims wanted revenge, that sooner or later someone would decide that if courts wouldn't provide justice, bullets would. The assassin came from within his own family. Years after the trials, the exact date lost to deliberately obscured records, James Hargis was murdered by his own son, Beach Hargis. Not by the Cockrell faction, not by relatives of James Markham or Dr. Cox or James Cockrell, by the child he'd raised, who'd grown up watching his father orchestrate murders, watching violence become county policy, watching power maintained through terror. What that did to Beach psychologically, the records don't document. There are no interviews, no psychological evaluations, no first-person accounts explaining why a son kills his father. But the legal system called it fratricide murder of a family member and convicted Beach of the crime. Beach Hargis received a life sentence. He was later released from prison, disappearing from the historical record as completely as his victims had. The Hargis empire built through intimidation, maintained through murder, defended through perjury, and jury tampering ended with a son killing his father. Whether that's karma, tragedy, or simply the inevitable conclusion of violence-based power depends entirely on your philosophical framework. But the pattern is clear. Systematic violence doesn't stop with victory. It continues until it destroys everything, including its architects. The Cardwell family's erasure from Breathitt County is so complete, it qualifies as historical extinction. T.P. Cardwell had 4 sons. During the feuds of 1902 and 1903, all 4 were either killed or wounded. His son-in-law, Dr. B.D. Cox, was assassinated while making a house call shot multiple times because he'd encouraged Markham to defend Tom Cockrell. The Cardwell name had been in Breathitt County for generations. They were landowners, respected family, people who expected their presence to matter. Within 2 years, their male line was effectively destroyed. A century later, the Cardwell name has virtually disappeared from the county. Descendants still live there. DNA proves continuity, but they carry other surnames, acquired through marriage or deliberate legal change. The violence was so thorough, the trauma so complete, that families chose to erase their own identity rather than carry the target it represented. Their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren live in Breathitt County today, anonymous survivors of a war their ancestors lost. They know the stories. They don't discuss them. Silence became survival strategy. How many people died in the Breathitt County War? Conservative estimates, based on documented deaths, 27 to 38 people in 1902 and 1903 alone. From November 1902 to June 1903, just 7 months at least. 30 confirmed fatalities. Some historians claim 320 deaths over decades. But that number likely includes unrelated violence retroactively attributed to the feuds. Every shooting and stabbing in Breathitt County for 20 years blamed on Haggis-Cockrell politics, whether connected or not. What's documented beyond dispute? Dr. Cox, James Cockrell, James Markham, and dozens whose names were never preserved in newspapers or court records. Poor men, black men, women, people whose deaths mattered less to the chroniclers of history, whose families couldn't afford attorneys to pursue justice. Every single one left behind children, widows, parents, siblings. Every death created ripples of trauma lasting generations. Every assassination taught the next generation that power comes from willingness to kill, and that law protects whoever controls the badges. This wasn't a feud. Feuds are between families, personal disputes over honor or land or ancient grievances. This was systematic political terrorism executed by elected officials, enabled by corrupted law enforcement, and tolerated by a federal system that intervened only after national embarrassment forced action. The Breathitt County Courthouse still stands in Jackson, Kentucky, 122 years after James Buchanan Markham's blood stained its steps. The limestone is worn smooth now, worn by another century of boots, by lawyers and defendants and ordinary citizens walking over history without knowing it, erasing the physical evidence of that May morning through nothing more than daily foot traffic. Tourists can walk up those steps today without realizing they're treading where Markham fell, where Curtis Jett stood with a smoking revolver, where hundreds of witnesses watched for 15 minutes while a body cooled and no one dared approach. There's no marker, no plaque explaining what happened, just steps like any other courthouse steps in any other American county seat. The building itself has been renovated multiple times. Electric lights replaced oil lamps. Air conditioning replaced open windows. The hallway where Jett waited with his weapon has been repainted, recarpeted, modernized into bureaucratic anonymity. You could stand exactly where he stood and never know it. The most infamous weapon in Breathitt County history, Curtis Jett's .45 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, the gun that killed James Markham and probably Dr. B.D. Cox, was donated to the county in 1963 to be auctioned for courthouse renovation funds. Then it vanished, lost to private collections, sold to someone who wanted a piece of mountain violence to display in a den or basement. Its current whereabouts are unknown. The physical instrument of assassination has disappeared into the same historical amnesia that swallowed most of this story. The violence became folklore before it became history. The Ballad of J.B. Markham was recorded by Lester McFarland and Robert A. Gardner on August 14, 1928, released as Brunswick 350. The song preserved the story and music for rural audiences who couldn't read newspapers but could remember melodies, who couldn't access court records but could pass songs down through generations. And then, gradually, deliberately, the story faded. Not because people forgot, because they chose not to remember. Because remembering meant acknowledging that their grandfathers had been assassins, or their grandmothers had married men who ordered murders. Because in a county where everyone is related to everyone else, you can't talk about the feuds without implicating your neighbors, your relatives, yourself. A descendant of one of the feuding families wrote online in 2020, "Although my family was the darker side of this song, it's part of our history. Amazing how these people hated each other bitterly, and 100 years later, descendants from both sides grow up as friends, having no idea that our great-grandparents were once at war. I guess it's one of the reasons nobody talks about the old feuds. Is that healing or dangerous forgetting? Can you achieve peace by simply refusing to discuss violence? Or does silence just mean the wounds never properly close? That the trauma gets transmitted to children and grandchildren who don't understand why their families carry certain tensions, avoid certain names, fall silent when certain topics arise? Here's the moral complexity that makes this story more than historical curiosity. Everyone involved had justification. Everyone believed they were defending something legitimate. Everyone was simultaneously victim and perpetrator. Was James Hargis a political boss who orchestrated systematic murder to maintain power? Yes, absolutely. His own nephew confessed that Hargis ordered the assassinations. He controlled elections through intimidation. He used violence methodically to eliminate opposition. He corrupted every institution designed to provide justice. Was he also a grieving brother defending family honor in a system that had failed him? Also, yes. Benjamin Hargis was shot and killed by the town marshal in a saloon. Tom Cockrell faced charges, but received aggressive legal defense from attorneys who'd previously represented the Hargis faction. From James Hargis's perspective, the legal system was being weaponized against his family by political opponents, using courts as substitute for bullets. Both things are true simultaneously. Hargis was both monster and victim, both murderer and grieving brother. The categories aren't mutually exclusive. Was James Markham a courageous attorney standing up to corruption at the cost of his own life? Yes. He knew he was marked for death. He filed affidavits documenting the conspiracy. He wrote letters to newspapers exposing the violence. He stayed in BREATHITT County when fleeing would have saved his life. He chose principle over survival. Was he also a political operative who switched sides for advantage and used his own children as human shields? Also, yes. He'd represented the Hargis faction for years, learning their methods, profiting from their patronage. Then he switched to their opponents, using insider knowledge against former clients. He deliberately walked everywhere with his children beside him, calculating that assassins wouldn't risk killing a child to reach him. He weaponized his own family for protection. Both things can be true. That's what makes this story so profoundly uncomfortable. There are no heroes here, just people making choices that seem justified in the moment until you count the bodies. This story isn't really about moonshine stills or mountain politics or courthouse steps in 1903. It's about what happens when power becomes absolute and law becomes meaningless. When the people sworn to enforce justice are the ones committing murder. When witnesses watch crimes happen in broad daylight and stay silent because speaking costs everything. It's about a question every person in BREATHITT County faced. What would you do when the system offers no protection? When elected officials order assassinations and get acquitted? When testifying means your house burns and your family becomes targets? Would you be Belvin Ewan testifying despite terror, knowing your house had already been destroyed, knowing they could kill you next, choosing truth even when truth offered no reward? Would you be Curtis Jett, following family loyalty into murder, spending decades trying to atone through Bible study and teaching Sunday school, discovering redemption in prison while your victims remained dead? Would you be James Markham, refusing to flee, filing lawsuits and writing newspapers, hoping federal intervention would arrive before the bullet, using your own children as shields because survival required calculated cruelty? Or would you be one of the hundreds who watched from windows, who saw everything, who knew exactly who pulled the trigger and who gave the order and stayed silent because silence kept you breathing? These aren't historical curiosities. These questions get answered every day in places where powerful families control local politics, where law enforcement looks away from certain crimes, where ordinary people face the choice between submission and resistance. The monsters we fear aren't always obvious. Sometimes they're elected. Sometimes they wear badges. Sometimes they own the general store and sit in the county judge's seat and drink coffee at the same place you do. James Hargis walked Main Street in Jackson for years after his nephew confessed he'd ordered murders, acquitted of every charge, powerful until his own son killed him. That's not justice. That's just violence consuming itself. If this story made you think about power, accountability, and the price we pay when systems fail, leave your like and subscribe for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about American justice. Comment below. What would you have done? Would you have testified like Ewan fled like Markham's family? Or stayed silent? Because the line between defender and tyrant isn't as clear as we'd like to believe. And in BREATHITT County, that line was written in blood on courthouse steps, one assassination at a time, to